Back at the museum archive office with Jean Hunt Steffens, who is going to give us some background information on her Hunt family ancestors that her father was so very proud of.
Yes, he was proud of them. Thomas Hunt came here real early. He's in the Eastville records in 1634 is the first one. And my dad was proud of this. One of the Thomas Hunts, there was 5 that I've seen in a row, and one of them he liked because he got sent out in a rowboat to spend the day because he cussed the king, so that was his punishment. And there's a sign down Hunt's Point. We're sort of assuming that's where the Hunts came in. Don't know that for sure. And then his grandfather was Washington Hunt. They had 16 kids. 5 of them died young. They didn't make it to adulthood. But between his grandfather and his grandmother's side, there we're related to half the Eastern Shore. I think that he went to school in Seaview. There was a school there. I always thought that's where he went because whenever he'd tell something that happened when he was young, we'd be driving through Seaview and he'd think of something. Then he went to Hampton, Sydney. He was there by the time he was 13, and his brother Hugh was there. He was younger, 4 years younger. He was there by the time he was 13 also. He was in the army for a while, but it was peacetime and you could buy yourself out at that time. So he had to stay in a year, but he could buy himself out, and he wanted to go to Hawaii. So he asked to be stationed there, and he bought himself out in Hawaii, and he stayed there for a while. He lived in Panama for a while, and then he came back to the shore. He lived in Baltimore for a while, and he wrote for the Baltimore Sun, apparently, but he was supposed to be covering a serious story, and he interjected a little humor, so he got fired from that one. He married my mother then. She was from up around Pocomoke, Salisbury, up that way, Groton, the Grotons. So then they came back. My mother had TB, so they came back to the shore, and he worked on the water. She died when I was about a year old, and then he built boats, and he fished and clammed, and he got a brain aneurysm, and they told him to quit all heavy lifting. So that's when we moved to Oyster. I was about 13, and he still worked on the water because he loved working on the water, but that's when he started writing. And first it was serious articles, but he couldn't stay serious, so.
Now, where did you say you lived before y'all moved to Oyster?
Cateville. Actually, we lived where the cemetery is that y'all covered for the Cobbs. We lived down that dirt road, Herman Richardson's property. Don't remember. Well, it was on the Seaside Road. I'm trying to think who lived. It was who lived there. I thought that cemetery is where they've got. They had a dedication for Cobb. So I'm thinking the Cobbs owned a house down there somewhere, but I don't know exactly where. It's farm. Herman Richardson, Bruce Richardson, and his sons have it now, so.
Okay. Is that it?
Stop. I don't know where to go now. Okay. At first he started writing for the Eastern Shore News serious stories and the Virginia Pilot serious stories. He talked about these. He covered pony penning. He covered one year the open houses for the garden club, and serious stories like that. But he just lapsed into humor.
Okay, so tell us, when did your dad start writing?
He started writing in 1956, maybe 55, but I have copies of 56. And first, as I said, it was serious stories. Then he started writing a weekly column for the Eastern Shore News. And he had different titles. Oyster Bits was the first one, I think. Eastern Shorelines. Then he started writing for a weekly column for the Virginia Pilot Ledger Star, and these were. First, he started writing about the seafood, the crabs were in and stuff like that. And then he started writing about the people, Terrible Crockett and Filter Tip McCready and Fearless Reynolds and all those characters. He liked to write about Oyster. And of course, this story is somewhat true and somewhat humor.
They named it Oyster.
Of course, Oyster was Cobb's Mill originally, I believe. I think that's in that story. And he had, who made the first raw oyster. Somebody's got a book out entitled that now. Great Bloody Mary, Doctor, the first raw oyster. That was a little later, looks like that was 65. He did a lot of letters to the editor. So some of these are letters to the editor. This one, if I can get it open. They found a skeleton on the seaside. I often wondered what could be buried down there because that mud is like quicksand. And so he took it to over to the museum in Williamsburg, and I don't know if they ever figured out exactly what it was, but I think other things have been found too. People that are more familiar with Oyster could give you better information on all the stuff that's been found there. Then they started writing about my dad. This was two reporters from the Virginia Pilot. This is Kay Crum and myself when we lived in the trailer across from Kay. And my dad said everybody was hiding out in Oyster because they thought they were revenuers.
That's funny.
Oyster Bits, that's another one. He started, when he moved to Norfolk, he sold trailers. He liked trailers. He thought that was, and actually it's a good way for single people to live. Then he started writing for, later on he wrote for Sight and Sound magazine. If I can find it here. He had stories in here. on Commonwealth magazine. There's a story in here about him, and then he wrote a story in here. But he ran for lieutenant governor and for state delegate one year, but he didn't win. So Commonwealth magazine stories. How Sam lost his soul clamming. Cabbage liquor, that would have to be, it's got Terrible Crockett in there because he always associated Terrible Crockett with making cabbage liquor.
That's funny.
When he was running for lieutenant governor, they did a lot of stories on him, and this is where he's picking the asparagus in front of his house. These are stories when he ran for delegate for the Eastern Shore. He ran against Bill Fears. And it says candidate night was a lively event. I'm sure my dad made it lively. And an amateur answers questions. That was when he ran for lieutenant governor, and he lost. And then he wrote a letter to the editor. He formed the Hard Losers Club after he lost.
That's funny. He had a sense of humor, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Don Hill wrote a lot of stories about him, and Don Hill once told him that he had made more money writing about him than my dad made writing, which was probably true. These were in the Washington Post, and one of my favorite pictures of him.
Oh wow, this is really neat.
Yeah, I love that picture, and I've got one. I can of him by the post office in Oyster. This is about the Oyster Chamber of Commerce when they were trying to raise enough money with oyster roast for that. He calls it the Chamber Awakens. And they got the oyster. I don't know how much they had to raise, but they got the oyster harbor dredged.
Oh, so that was fundraiser to dredge the oyster harbor. Okay.
Yeah. Letters to the editor. He liked to write letters to the editor. He could cover every subject when I try to get it in some sort of togetherness. Back in the 70s, a group of investors bought some of the barrier islands, and they were going to build houses on the barrier islands, which everybody knows now was not a good idea. And so he started writing. He went to see the governor and he wrote to everybody. And he started writing about what would become of that if they built. He called it mass suicide. And this is when the Nature Conservancy bought the Barrier Islands, or different people, I guess, bought them, but he wrote all these letters to the editor, and he was upset about that.
Yeah, that was really a crazy idea, wasn't it?
That would be like it's happening down in Nag's Head now. The house is falling down. Only at least they have a road to get out of there. They didn't have a road to get out of anything. One of the stories he wrote, Barry Truitt and Brooks Miles Barnes wrote Seashore Chronicles.
I love that book. I reference it a lot. Yeah.
And one of the chapters in it was by my dad, While the Islands Are Still There, which was a really interesting story. I have the story somewhere, but I didn't bring it. I just brought the book. So then, when my dad passed away, everybody wrote something about it. All the writers, but Don Hill wrote a nice article about when the man who required a resourceful messenger, and he won an award for his story. So I thought that was kind of cool.
So now I think we'd like to talk a little bit about that leisure.
Oh, the Advocate of Leisure.
Yeah.
Yes, I almost forgot about that.
Okay, so tell us about this little publication here that you have in your hands.
The Advocate of Leisure. He started publishing this little book back in the late 50s, and he did 3 of them, and so he would sell an ad inside to keep it, so he could afford printing, and he didn't charge much for the ad, but he covered different businesses, and one of them was George Savage. And I saw George a few years ago, and he reminded me that my dad had written that story about him. And what he said was that George was too tight to buy an ad. So he said next time he went in, George handed him $20 and told him to take that ad out. It made him look bad. So Savage's Drugstore.
Okay. And so the characters that he wrote about, and this book was postmarked, what,
1956.
Mm-hmm. So the characters he wrote about were all folks from Oyster, right?
Yeah, they were all people and they would do something that would remind him, like one of his campaign ads was they raised $2 to build a airplane, and how they did this piece of plywood and stuff. But at first, when he started writing about him, they would get mad because he used their real name. And so then he started naming them. Filter Tip McAllister was one, and Cat Pennywell, that was what everybody called him, really, even that. But he wrote a lot about Cat Pennywell.
Was it, wait a minute, it was Filter Tip McCready.
McCready, right. Yeah. And there was a McAllister, too. I don't know who that was. He didn't live in Oyster, I don't think. But he had different names for him. Wildcat Hinman, that would have been Russell Hinman. And it was, a lot of people probably can remember what their dad was called.
Oh, I see. Here it is. I asked Filter Tip McCready if he'd invent a device after I thought out what we'd need. This is so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I know they're laced with humor,
Right.
but they're based on actual events, right?
They are. And he had a lot of, when he got older, he had a lot of good ideas. I would love to know what he'd say today. But a lot of his ideas, the letters he wrote were things that they're doing now, that he was kind of ahead of his time with. So like the pushing up the dirt to keep the fire from getting to his house, and
building a berm there around his house, and they do a lot more of that. Now
seems like a good way to stop a
fire. Wow, sounds like he was an amazing man.
I'm very lucky because I've had some characters in my life: my dad, my husband, and my neighbor, and so I've been very lucky. I think they gave me a sense of humor.
And you lived first, in Capeville?
Yeah, we lived in Capeville. My grandfather, my dad grew up on a farm. His grandfather gave his kids that wanted to farm, when they got married, he gave them a farm. And so my grandfather had a farm on the Seaside Road, and he lost his farm during the Depression. Excuse me. And then he used to work in the ABC store in Cape Charles. It's neat. Still there now. I think it's where the realty company is, down on the end.
Oh, right next to the cider place. Yeah.
And then my dad went all over, traveled all over, but he came back, and we lived there when I was in elementary school, and on Herman Richardson's farm. And so then he moved to Oyster.
And seems like that's where he really found his calling, was in Oyster, huh?
Yeah. We even lived in Chincoteague for a couple of years. He went up there. He worked for the post office. But I don't think it was enough. He missed the writing part and working on the water. And then he moved to Norfolk, and he was there for a while. He'd go back and forth from Oyster to Norfolk working after he married my stepmom. My stepmom and Paul, he married the two of them. So he raised Paul too. And so it was quite a journey for him.
So when he was in North, he never came back here after he...
he did. They'd come over on weekends. And he would come over here a lot, just stay over here. This is where Oyster's where he passed away.
Oh, okay.
And, but he used to say that he and Margaret got along best when she was over there and he was over here.
Yeah.
They were friends, And he said one time he would call Margaret, and he'd have something to tell her, and she'd talk and tell her about her day. And by the end, he'd forgotten what he was going to tell her.
That's funny.
Yeah. So Paul's over here. He lives around Eastville. He was in the Army, and he went to VMI, I think it was. I'm not sure, but I was gone then, so I was off.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to say about...
I can't think of anything.
Herman Hardtimes Hunt, right?
I'm sure when I get home I'll think, I should have told you that. But
today is September the 23rd, 2024, and we are filming a video interview with Jean Hunt Steffens for the Cape Charles Museum. Hi, Jean. Can you tell us about a few things that were here in the old Oyster Village?
Yeah. When I moved here, was when my dad and I moved here. McCready's store was right across here. They on the back there was a dock that my dad used to bring, and everybody would bring oysters and clams and fish and sell them and weigh them and stuff. My father called it later McCready's Beanery, and that's where the Oyster Chamber of Commerce originated, and that was started when they needed money to dredge the harbor, and they couldn't get enough. They had to come up with a third or something like that. And they had oyster rests in the side here to raise money. And so they started the Oyster Chamber of Commerce for that. If you wanted to join, you wrote your name on the wall. If you wanted to resign, you erased your name. So
I love it.
And then right next to it, right here was Haney Smith's office, and he bought oysters and clams and fish and crabs.
Was it here? Or was it on the concrete pad here?
It was on the concrete pad.
Okay.
The Horse Island Trail wasn't there then. That was made through oyster shells, where they dumped the oyster shells out, and then later made it go all the way around. So that's really nice. The Nature Conservancy has built all this, so it can come down.
Okay.
Granville and McCready lived right down this street.
I'm sorry.
At the end of the street.
Could you repeat?
The Bowens lived.
Did you say Granville
next to it?
Lived in that house there by the trees?
Yeah, the house that you can see the roof above. Of course, it wasn't raised then. They raised it later, and so they just had a little walk to get down here. And the Bowens lived where all those trees were. They were up there. That house is gone.
Oh, okay. Okay.
When I lived here, there was no house there, and Ren's Marshall had a trailer back in there that he lived in, and Ren's used to like to drink a little, my dad would call it fermented medicinal purpose, tip the bottle a little, and one night he was trying to find his way home, and he had a black dog, so he couldn't. So they tied a candle to the dog's tail so Ren's could follow the dog. And when the dog got all mixed up and started running all around and went under some bleachers that people were sitting on, and of course the candle's burning, they're all hopping up, jumping around. So that was, Ren's was one of the characters he liked to write about.
Oh, that's funny.
A lot of stories about Ren's. He didn't call him Ren's. I forget. I'll have to look, see what his name was he called. And
that's great.
He would originally he tried to write serious stories for the Eastern Shore News and the Virginian Pilot, but he always would interject some humor in there. So he finally just gave up, and that's what he wrote, humor.
And so he concentrated on his own humor stories.
Yeah, and they were a little outlandish, but funny.
And they basically all centered around
Oyster.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
Somebody said one time, because if they were in the store, they'd all sit around talking. They said, "Look out when Hardtimes jumps up and goes out. He's going to write about one of us." So that's over here.
Okay, do you want to tell me about where your dad lived and everything over here?
Yes, this is where my dad's house was down here. The road went down past those trailers through the woods. The woods wasn't there then; it was all cleared. And he worried about because the marsh comes right up here. He worried about the marsh catching fire, so he got a bulldozer, or paid for somebody to do it, to push the mud and sand, shells and everything up, making a berm, and then he planted trees all along it, and to keep if a fire started. And someone told us that once it did catch fire, and it stopped right there at that berm, but he planted blue spruce all in there and fig trees. So I wonder if the fig trees are left in there. Blue spruce in there. The house originally belonged to Cat Pennywell, and Cat Pennywell died on a boat. I think one of those stoves in their cabin, it asphyxiated him, and so my dad bought the house from him, and then that's when he embellished it a bit, added a room, and he liked that. He loved plywood because it had just come out, and he liked that. I don't know what you call it, that yellow stuff that has ridges and stuff. He liked that. That's what he made the roof out of. And so everybody said it looked like a pagoda. In front of the house, when he lived here, Webster had asparagus planted there. And the kind of one of the stories about my dad was somebody was visiting, and he told them, before you leave, take some asparagus. So they were picking asparagus, and then he found out later it wasn't his asparagus field, it was somebody else's. So
Oh, it wasn't G.L. Webster's?
it was Webster's, it wasn't my dad's.
Oh.
He thought, dang, he's got a lot of asparagus here. So that property belonged to the Travises. That was part of the Travis property in front.
Okay, would you like to tell us a little bit more about your dad? And his full name was?
Yeah, Herman Hunt. He originally, his father, he was a junior. He picked up the nickname Hardtimes. He claims that during the Depression, he visited a bootlegger a lot, and he never had enough money. And so one day he pulled up and he heard somebody say, "Hide the jug, Anna, here comes old Hardtimes." So that's where he got the Hardtimes name. And when he raised me, my mother died when I was about a year old. And so he raised me, worked on the water, oyster and clamming and whatever was in season, and building boats. He owned the property that Tommy O'Connor owns now, back then when I was a child. And when I left home, he met my stepmother, Margaret, and her son, Paul. I guess Paul was about 3, and they got married. And so she had a nursery school in Norfolk, 2 years up, all the way to 6th grade at one point. But they'd come over here on the weekends, and my dad loved to go over and cook for them. If it was Northeaster and he couldn't get out, he would go over and cook for them. But when I was about, I guess, 10 or 12, he got diagnosed with a brain aneurysm, and the doctor told him to quit all hard work, heavy lifting, and of course everything on the water is heavy lifting. So that's when he started writing, and his first stories were serious stories, but he just couldn't keep the humor out. So, and that's when we moved to Oyster. I was about 12, and he still worked on the water some, but not like he did. You know, he always loved working on the water, and he loved Oyster. So, was a perfect spot for him then.
Okay, go ahead and tell me about the driveway and where the house was and everything.
The driveway would have come in here and gone around a little bit, that circle, and his house would have been over in there. And I guess, you know, a lot of these trees, I'm thinking, have come from trees that he planted. Look at that great big one. It's beautiful. My stepmother used to like to decorate for Christmas, so she might have decorated that tree.
That thing is big.
Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Now it's deer all over and all in through here now.
And you said over here was the asparagus field?
That's the asparagus field. That whole field all the way out to the road.
Wow.
Was asparagus. And it was good. I had never eaten anything but fresh asparagus. And one time somebody from Webster's gave him some that had just been canned. It was still warm. Oh my gosh, it's so good. Love asparagus.
I do.
Too bad it isn't there. I wonder if any still comes up anywhere.
I know, wouldn't that be funny?
Yeah. Probably in there somewhere.
Yeah. Okay, so tell me about who lived over there.
Yeah, Mrs. McCready lived in the blue house, and my dad would talk about her in some of his stories because he was fascinated with outhouses, and he had an outhouse here. He made one out of a boat one time. He cut a big boat. He cut the boat in half and made an outhouse. But he used to always say Mrs. McCready could see through and see the outhouse. So
see through the field to his outhouse?
His outhouse. And there's one story that he talks about every time he needed a piece of plywood, because he had one built out of plywood too. He would take a piece of plywood off the outhouse. And so he had to keep some in front so Mrs. McCready couldn't see in the outhouse.
That's cute.
So.
Okay.